And if we take this figure of the founding fathers to the very moment of the Constituent Assembly, we realize that there was this whole idea of fatherhood or of fathering the Constitution, which was very much present in the making of the Constitution itself. There were continuous references to the American founding fathers and the American Constitution as something which was framed by men, exceptional men. And there is no doubt about the fact that the Indian Constituent Assembly was also full of exceptional men. There were numerous exceptional men there, and women were probably overshadowed by their presence even then. Uh, Even a quick look at the kind of the architecture of the Constituent Assembly, something that I was trying to research on, and I discovered this also very recently. There is a documentary series that Shyam Benegal has recently made called Samvidhan, and it shows members of the Constituent Assembly getting up at their desks and speaking aloud. But if we actually go back to history, we discover that the Constituent Assembly was actually not framed like that. It was not like our modern parliament. So one had to actually walk up to the center stage all the way from, if you're sitting on the back bench, from there, cross the whole, there were green carpets there, and then go there and make a speech. So every single intervention that was made by members of the Constituent Assembly has to be given the status of a speech and not just, just a standing up an intervention. So they were all prepared interventions in that sense. So you know that there will be a turn, you will be asked to come and speak on a particular issue, and you would prepare yourself for that speak. So this is my point behind talking about this issue is to explain that there was a lot of preparation that women had done before they came to the Constituent Assembly. Just as every single speech that they made in the Constituent Assembly was not a spontaneous speech. It was not just a knee-jerk reaction to something, some kind of a misogynist, sexist remark that a male member made there. They were prepared for all these interventions that they made there. And this preparation was also not done individually. This preparation was almost in all cases done as a part of a collective. And that's also very important to understand why I want to call them the founding mothers of the Indian Republic. Because individually, they may be a Renuka Rai or a Hansa Mehta or a Vijay Lakshmi Pandit or a Sucheta Kripalani or a Purnima Banerjee, Dakshayani Velayudhan and Durgabai Deshmukh. These are some of the most important female members of the Constituent Assembly, but they performed their role as the founders of the Indian Constitution or framers of the Indian Constitution as a collective. This They would meet in the evenings, they would decide that this is what we are going to say tomorrow. And the nature of the framing of the Indian Constituent Assembly was also such that it allowed its members to prepare for quite some time before they went and made their intervention. So, for example, there were committees, and the committees had their own proceedings. The questionnaires were distributed much in advance. Even when the constitutional advisor B.N. Rao presented his draft of the first draft of the Constitution, it was in public sphere for quite some time. Then Ambedkar's draft was also in the public sphere for quite some time. Printed copies of the Constitution, the proposed Constitution, or all the resolutions of the various committees of the Constituent Assembly, the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee, the Minority Subcommittee, all these committees and their proceedings, their resolutions were also available to the members. So it basically it becomes difficult to believe that in a committee in a Constituent Assembly like that, women who were of that eminence, who had been in public life, who had been in the political public sphere for so long, they would not have been able to make their intervention. So that's something that becomes clear once we start looking at this thing. Going a little back to this whole in history, one can see that these are the same women who had been at the forefront of women's rights movements in India, at least for 2 decades before they came into the Constituent Assembly. The point in history that I choose as a turning point is 1927, when the All India Women's Conference was formed. And it so happens that of the 17 members who were elected into the Constituent Assembly, there were 17 in total who had at various points been elected to the Constituent Assembly. If you want the names, I can cite them. but I think that would be beside the point. So initially, 15 women were elected on the in the first election that happened in August 1946, and the members from the Muslim League, Begum Shaista Ikram Mullah and Begum Jahanara Shah Nawaz, they could not join the Constituent Assembly because of this. Leela Roy resigned from the Constituent Assembly as a protest against the partition. Malati Chaudhary, who was then the president of the Utkal Provincial Congress Committee, she also resigned, understanding that this is not her kind of work. Constitution making involves a different kind of legal acumen, which she does not have. Instead, she chose to go back to Odisha to do her um, Gandhian social work, quote unquote. So finally, we were left with 8 or 9 women. All of them, nearly all of them, barring Dakshayani Vela Yudhan, the sole Dalit woman. Uh, I'm using the category anachronistically, but apart from her, almost every single member was at some point or the other an office bearer of the All India Women's Conference. Members were either as president or as vice president. They had held various very important and also very interesting and I think remarkable posts within the All India Women's Conference. To cite a few, Renuka Ray from 1931 was in charge of the Legal Disabilities Committee of the All India Women's Conference. So from 1931 onwards, she was engaged uh, in campaigning for the removal of what they would call the legal disabilities of women. By 1941 or 1943, when the Hindu Code Bill, the first Hindu Code Committee was formed in 1941, and 1943, when she was elected to the Central Assembly to represent women's issues regarding the reforms in the Hindu Code Bill, she had already collected or amassed a lot of information about the legal system of India and how one can change that. So that is her status. Hansa Mehta was a part of the Labor Committee of the All India Women's Conference, had been at the forefront of struggle for equal wages for women, and had been also engaged with important international feminist organizations. She was the vice president of the International Alliance for Women, which was a conglomerate of several feminist organizations of that time, in 1946, when she was elected to the Constituent Assembly. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who could not be elected to the Constituent Assembly because the socialists decided not to join it, she was the president of the AIWC till 1944, was also a very important feminist figure who was involved in a very specific kind of work for the AIWC. So this is what I think is a very important preparatory phase for the women to come into the Constituent Assembly. Two important ideas that emerge if one look at their activities in the 2 decades from 1927 to 1947. Two of the important ideas that come to my mind, at least I think they are very important for the purposes of understanding how they came into the Constituent Assembly, one was to engage in a certain kind of constitutional politics, working their way through the genre of the Indian Constitution. Historians of constitutional historians would know that from 1935, the Government of India Act 1935 onwards, the term that was used for these Government of India Acts was the Constitution, and there was a kind of a constitutional framework within which the decentralization of power, the legislatures were already there from 1937 onwards. All these bills for the Hindu code, Hindu law reforms from the Sarda Act onwards were presented in a form which had prepared these women extremely well for what is the task of making a constitution. Two major documents that are, I would say, are antecedents to the Indian Constitution, especially to the Fundamental Rights chapter and the directive principles of state policy of the Indian Constitution, are the National Planning Committee's subcommittee on women's role in planned economy. Uh, some scholars do talk about this document now. It is one of those even by our standards, it is, I would say, it's one of the most radical documents that Indian feminism has ever produced. So this was produced in 1939. Hansa Mehta was a member of, was one of the co-authors of the document, and it had already started looking at women as special subjects, special citizens who need special care, who need a special attention from the state, colonial or national. And from the National Planning Committee report onwards, this is 1939. I believe, I don't have an exact date for that, but my uh, the best guess that I have is that the document was prepared by 1940. So 1940, they had already produced a full-scale document about the status of women in India as an economy. So that was already there, and it had rigorous observations about women as workers, women as family members, women as political participants, and so on. Had in its own way redefined the whole idea of women's rights. The other document, which I think, which actually, as Hansa Mehta put it before the as a preface to that document, the Indian Women's Charter for Rights and Duties, was prepared in December 1945, and by 1946 it was already circulated among all the provincial legislatures in India, to several international organizations, including the feminist organizations of which these women were part of, and um, also at the United Nations Subcommission on the Status of Women. So by 1946, there was already a set of demands. There was a kind of a vision of what the future citizen of India, the female citizen of India, would be like. Sex had become a very important principle for understanding the social political structure of of the state and of the society by 1946. So these are some of the documents which I think have we need to look at, which I present as a kind of as documents which anticipate women's interventions in the Constituent Assembly. Uh, just one line about the entire process. I think it's important to remember that the kind of feminism that was practiced by AWC between 1927 and 1947 must be characterized as a very unique form of feminism, because it worked as uh, with a certain kind of pragmatism, working in collaboration with progressive men, making small groups of people with whom they could work. For example, from 1943 to 1947, these are just empirical facts, but very, very important in the context of this history. These 4 years or 5 years, Indian Women's Association, All India Women's Conference, worked very closely with B.N. Rao, who was the chair of the Hindu Law Committee, and all the arguments that they could make, the basic principles about rights, about what is absolute estate in ancestral property, and so on. He, in a sense, I would say it was a kind of a honing of skills when women started working with B.N. Rao. And that reflected later in the Constituent Assembly also, when women worked in several committees and worked with the major male figures around them. So that's that whole politics of working with men in collaboration. And throughout this whole process, they had learned how to deal with the adversaries, how to negotiate, how to sometimes even bargain for a little gain, and so on, before they came to the Constituent Assembly. A few lines again, words about the election to the Constituent Assembly, which draws our attention to another crucial feature of women's participation. 1932 onwards, after the Pune Pact, there was a kind of, a kind of a configuration of Indian politics in terms of separate electorates and joint electorates, and the Congress was for joint electorates. So women found themselves in a very unique position, because on the one hand they were trying to expand the base of their movement, and represent what would be create a kind of a theory and practice of representation in which all women could represent all women. Uh, a very specific example would be that of Hamid Ali, Begum Hamid Ali, who was twice the president of the All India Women's Conference and was at the forefront of the Hindu law reform. And a similar kind of reversal when Hindu women would also work for reforms in Muslim law. So this particular idea that representation is not to be confined or reified to a community which was essentially a patriarchal community and which was represented by patriarchs was very crucial to their politics, and that showed in this idea their refusal to ask for any kind of reservations in the Constituent Assembly. There have been a lot of criticism about women's refusal to, seek reservation, thinking that they were privileged women and so on and so forth. But I think that the reading that emerges from this whole fact is about women not wanting to create a different, to reinforce this whole idea of patriarchal communities to be represented on the basis of proportional ratios, like a certain community to be represented according to their ratios. The idea was to be if there was to be a positive discrimination, to be positively discriminated in favor of the needs that women had, and those needs were enormous. So special childcare facilities, maternity benefits, equal work for equal pay for equal work, scholarships in education, and so many other demands that had already crystallized by the time the Indian Women's Charter for Rights and Duties was created. So that is something that one needs to keep in mind when we think of the campaign that these women had led for the election to the Constituent Assembly. I will just cite one simple example. I'm just fascinated by this example because when Dakshayani Velayudhan, who was not a member of the AIWC and who had earlier even criticized the AIWC for being elitist, if not casteist, when she wanted to get elected to the Constituent Assembly, and Dakshayani was incidentally very was not in favor of separate electorates, as Ambedkar was. Although on other counts, she was a member of the All India Scheduled Caste Federation. So when she wanted to get elected to the Constituent Assembly, coming from Cochin, and she had to get elected from Madras because that was the Legislative Assembly, the kind of opposition that she had to face was from almost all corners. So the people from Madras opposed her election because she was from Cochin. Men opposed her election because she was a woman. The Dalit men opposed because she was not in favor of separate electorates. The upper caste men opposed her election because she was a Dalit woman, and so on and so forth. And eventually, she did get elected to the Constituent Assembly. This is just an instance that shows how difficult and what kind of a sight the figure of a woman had become before she got elected to the Constituent Assembly. So, for example, Amrit Kaur, when Patel, and I'm forgetting the names of the two or three other people. The Indian National Congress had a committee for monitoring the elections to the Constituent Assembly. And in the proceedings of that committee, it emerges that they were very happy with the election of Amrit Kaur because she was both a woman and a Christian. So she was a Christian woman, which made it easier for them to bring her in. So, but anyway, that's besides the point. The larger point that I was trying to draw from this concept of representation that women were bringing in was their continuous desire to bring in women from all sorts to the Constituent Assembly. There was a list of around 20 to 21 women that they had floated, and they were continuously campaigning, writing to various provincial legislatures, to the chief ministers, then called prime ministers of all these states, to elect these women from their provinces. And interestingly, also, they were deliberately not taking, or there were also certain women who were excluded from that list. One name that strikes that is very strikingly excluded is that of Mridula Sarabhai. who was a very important member of the All India Women's Conference. But by the time the AIWC had started campaigning, she had drifted away from the official position of AIWC on certain issues, including Hindu law reforms and also probably question of on the question of partition. So there were certain some women who were, I mean, I'd not want to use the word clique, but there was definitely a kind of a collective which was at work, which worked hard to get these women elected to the Indian Constituent Assembly. The fact was that the Constituent Assembly seats were not easily available, and it was clear that women could only get elected from by their own communities, because it was the cabinet mission had provided that only one could be only elected from members of their own communities, so at least for the Hindus and Muslims. So that actually ruled out the election of many Muslim women members in the Constituent Assembly. The only Muslim members that could come to the Constituent Assembly were members of the Muslim League, rather than from any other party. So that is why Hamid Ali I was talking about, she could not come and she couldn't become a part of that. Aruna Asif Ali couldn't be a part of the Indian Constituent Assembly, and several other important Muslim members. Finally, the question is, how would they? What did they do in the Constituent Assembly? I think I will. The question was how marginal they were, and the answer is that their presence in the Constituent Assembly was so overwhelming, and the contribution that they had made was so huge that actually one can write a chapter each on each of the articles to which they had contributed. I would focus on only a couple of them, but primarily with this with the framework that I have presented so far. The right to equality, for example, Article 15 of the Indian Constitution, very interesting proposition, or I think a strategy that one can discern in women's practices or engagement with the Constituent Assembly, was not to speak much on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, but try to get as much as is possible done in the various committees of which they were a part. So the fundamental rights subcommittee, of which only two women were part, Hansa Mehta and Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. Of them, again, Hansa Mehta was in the initial days was away in New York, participating in the framing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights here as a member of the Commission on Human Rights. So she was here. So it was left primarily to Amrit Kaur and sometimes to Hansa Mehta also to speak on behalf of all these women. And there are at least 3 notes of dissent that Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta had presented in the Fundamental Rights Subcommittee, which are of very, very significant implications for the final draft that we had of the Indian Constitution. One was their refusal to include the word practice in the right to freedom article. So the first draft of that article said that there will be freedom to practice, propagate one's religion. So they objected to the word practice, saying that the word practice will undo all the gains that they had made over the last 100 years of women's movement. Because practicing of a religion would probably mean so many the sustenance of or persistence of so many of the patriarchal activities that many things, even for example, the sati was an extreme example, but several other examples they were citing would probably not be able to would get a kind of a protection from this particular right. So, but that was not finally accepted, though women's note of dissent is of extreme importance. One is because they objected to the word practice, and that opens a number of theoretical possibilities about understanding their understanding of what is secularism for them. So secularism, and this is also to be read absolutely simultaneously with the Hindu law debates, Hindu code bill debates that were happening in the parallel sessions of the Constituent Assembly. Because the same Constituent Assembly was performing the role of an ordinary parliament when it was not drafting the Indian Constitution, and they were taking up all the bills. One look at that particular document can show how women were continuously doing translations of what they are saying here in the Constituent Assembly as drafters of the Constitution, and there as people intervening in specific bills that were being debated. And the entire thrust of their argument is that of secularizing law as far as possible. So one example that I have become recently very fond of is the example of Hansa Mehta's very strong objection to the idea to the law, to the provision on adoption in the Hindu Code Bill. So when Ambedkar had brought it in 1948, the Hindu Code Bill of Ambedkar did not allow uh, did not have a provision for daughters to be adopted. So a female girl child cannot be adopted because the traditional secular, the traditional religious idea behind the principle behind adoption was that only a son can be of some spiritual benefit for the father. So there was no question of adopting a daughter. And Hansa Mehta's consistent questioning of these kinds of laws, reading them in line with the note of dissent that she had made for the right to freedom of religion clause, can be read together to see how their investment in the whole idea of secularism. To that, one can also add, and I think Indian Constitution was probably one of those rare constitutions where, at least during the debates, the women members proposed that there should be a provision in the Constitution, a kind of a fundamental right that allows people to marry in the community, to have inter-community marriages. So marrying someone from the other community, and this is, we are talking in 2020 when we have several states in India contemplating banning the marriages between Hindus and Muslims, and this is 1940. When we have partition, when we have a lot of massacre and communal riots happening, and women standing completely against the current, and that was also the current of the Constituent Assembly, against that current, and asking for a right to marry in the community of the other, maintaining all the religious identities that they had. So this was one note of dissent. The second idea, again coming from the same thing, I think it will take a lot of time if I start talking about the Uniform Civil Code, but the whole question behind the operative part of the note of dissent that Mehta and Amrit Kaur present before the Fundamental Rights Committee is that if you cannot make it possible for the Uniform Civil Code to be a part of the fundamental rights, if it is to be shifted to the directive principles, then you have to make the directive principles more fundamental, more central to the Indian polity than you are than you want it to be. It is actually their intervention, the letter of dissent that Amrit Kaur and Hansa Mehta had written. The words have literally been lifted from their note of dissent when they said that the directive principles of state policy have to be nonetheless fundamental to the governance of the country, and it should be the duty of the state, which is another term that had been in feminist circles working for the last 20 years, the duty of the state. So it should be the duty of the state to apply these principles when making laws. That became finally the Article 37 of the Indian Constitution, which has been the lever through which the entire judicial interpretation that has ensured the ascendancy of directive principles in constitutional discourse has happened. To add to this is also I would also want to remember that most of these women had socialist sympathies, and the directive principles, which were about the socio-economic rights of the Indian citizen, once they discovered that they are being relegated to the directive principles, they understood that the vision that they had of the socio-economic rights uh, would probably become just a pious declaration, will not make much of a difference to the future republic. So they also put in that particular word to make sure that the directive principles have the value that they deserve to have. Supporting this particular argument, um, one can cite a number of later interventions by these women during the framing of the directive principles and after the constitution came into force, when they started enacting, or I would use the word activating, several of these principles in the articles in the directive principles of state policy. To cite one example before I forget would be Durgabai Deshmukh, who became the first, who was a member of the first planning commission, founded the Central Social Welfare Board, and produced some of the most important uh, works of planning. It's surprising that we don't talk much about her on the development planning of India. Uh, Two important documents that come to my mind. One is a massive work of great significance, the Encyclopedia of Social Work that she edited in 1966, and another one which she had done 10 years before that in 1956, called Social Legislation for Social Welfare. In both of these documents, one can see the thrust of her argument is to see how the directive principles can be activated, how the states can be forced to make laws which are in accordance with the directive principles. Of course, keeping the fundamental rights in place. So that is another, I think, very important contribution that these women had during the making of the constitution. One more article which I think should suffice to show the kind of keen interest that women had taken in the making the constitution would be the article would be their refusal to agree on the clause on conscription. So in the Fundamental Rights Committee, it was almost decided that military conscription would be compulsory. Ambedkar was quite in favor of that, and actually, and that shows very much in the proceedings of the Fundamental Rights Committee and the Advisory Committee, because the opposition to military conscription uh, is read as if this is a kind of a Gandhian idealism, putting forward some kind of a quixotic notion of non-violent nation state. And this is happening in 1947, just after the Second World War and during these skirmishes with Pakistan. So that is the time when women said that, no, we cannot have military conscription in a country like India. And the reasons that they show are two. One is that we have quite a huge population. So we do not need to make it compulsory for people to do something like that. The second argument they give is military conscription is a form of coercion. It's a kind of a forcing of people to do something which is against their wishes. So you can't do that. Anything, the state cannot be allowed to force this. And the third argument that they give is the third argument they give is that if you really want to have conscription, let us have conscription for social services. We should train people who will work for the building of the nation state. And we can do that. That actually becomes the germ of what is now known in India as the National Cadet Corps, the NCC. A little background information to this would also be, I have not been able to pursue this line of research uh, sufficiently, but I just want to mention this, is women's engagement with the dissolution of what was then called the Women's Auxiliary Corps. As women's movement activists, they were continuously fighting for the rights of women, for protection of women who were during the Second World War taken into the WAC. And those experiences came directly into the making of the Constitution, and that's how we do not have the clause on military conscription in the Indian Constitution. More than that, this also is an extension of women's investment in the right to liberty. That was a core of the liberal principle with which they had been working in, and which was part of the Women's Charter that they had prepared in 1945. So one can see. This also helps me to introduce another important member of the Constituent Assembly, Purnima Banerjee, whose interventions were for uh, very a very interesting intervention. She asked for, of course, there were two groups in the Constituent Assembly on the clause on preventive detention, and Purnima Banerjee argued in the same line as Hansa Mehta was arguing from 1945 onwards, that we cannot have, if you cannot completely prohibit preventive detention, it is the state's responsibility to make sure that the family of the person, if he is the breadwinner of the family, has to be given some kind of an allowance. What is the possibility? And that is because these are all women who had great legal acumen. What are you going to do to compensate for people who are later acquitted, or who are found to be who are not found to be guilty of something for which you have detained them? On this debate also one finds very interesting arguments, but all of them come from women's engagement with constitutional politics right from 1940s. So there are several, and they had all been also members of the. They had all been at the in the 1942 Quit India movement. They had all been jailed. They had, during their political activities also, they had been taken prisoners. Prison reform was an important part of the AIWC. All of them came to have an implication on their debates in the Constituent Assembly. So these are, I think, some of the ideas with which I could say that they have played a very important role. I just want to say two more things which I just want to share now, and maybe then we can conclude this. Uh, the idea, and this is about reservations, the whole question of women striking as a kind of an extra spoke in the wheel of nation. That was something that was continuously playing on their minds, especially because even as they stood in the Constituent Assembly, in a masculinist parliament, when they stood up in the Constituent Assembly, everybody would look at them, and they were carrying the burden of being women. It was not a very, in that sense, it was not normalized in Indian parliaments even at that point to see women rising and going to the dais and speaking and even questioning people. And there are several examples. Renuka Ray had challenged Nehru on certain issues, and they had stopped talking to each other for quite some time. Dakshayani Velayudhan would challenge a number of men, including Jagjeevan Ram, who was the labor minister then, a Dalit labor minister. So there were several such examples, which I think should be taken into account when we try to understand the enunciations of these women in the Constituent Assembly. So that can help us understand their position on what is called, or what is positive discrimination or affirmative action. A very interesting twist in this whole thing happens uh, when we discover that women were so cautious about the wording of every article that they would make sure that whenever there is a clause on non-discrimination, sex is included as a ground on which discrimination cannot be practiced. They were not satisfied with the word class, to which many of the male members were relegating them to, saying, okay, this is one class. Why do you have to continuously keep mentioning the word sex at each point? They did it continuously so that there is not a single article in the Equality Code of the Indian Constitution which does not have the term sex. Which is very interestingly now, and even in the Constituent Assembly, there was this debate. I think it was K.M. Panikkar who said, does the word sex also mean men? or does it only mean women? And that has, ironically, I think it's a very sweet irony of our judicial discourse, that now the word sex also means the third sex or the third gender, and that whole thing has now become the word, the ambiguity or the ambivalence of the term, which was there, has made it possible for the Supreme Court to pronounce several very progressive judgments relating to gender and sexuality. So that happened with this small word, this small but persistent, like stubborn kind of endeavor that women had of adding sex to all these clauses. On the other hand, when there was this little suggestion that, okay, so there will be no discrimination. This is something I will not probably be able to put right now. I'm not in the best frame to put it. It's a very interesting syntactical arrangement of the of the constitutional articles with which women were engaging. So all the articles were framed in negative terms. So the state shall not do this, the state shall not do that. Whenever there was an argument which was about what the state cannot do, where this discrimination has to stop, they would put the word sex. And whenever there was a possibility of making an exception to that thing, okay, you can make some exception, uh, women would say, okay, you can also add sex there. So you have the right to discriminate on the basis of sex. You can have the right to discriminate for women. This becomes more clear if one looks at, again, the performance that they had in the Constituent Assembly as a legislature. I just was trying to make a list of the number of interventions that women were making uh, or demanding to give special privileges or special support to women. That included uh, the demand to make sure that women can also drive rickshaw and taxi. Women can also be in the defense. There should be special medical colleges for women. There should be special scholarships for women to go and study abroad. So all kinds of demands which are being made, that becomes in the words of the article 15.3 of the Indian Constitution, special provisions for women and children. That children part, I think, was a compromise with which women did not, to which women did not object. This was Amrit Kaur, and once this was done on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, women kept quiet, knowing fully well that they had kept pragmatically that ethical, posture that they had, or maybe also continued without compromising on their persistent demand, that persistent refrain that we do not want any special privileges, we don't want reservations, and so on. But on the other hand, they continued asking for these provisions. Theoretically speaking, it seems that what women were asking for was positive discrimination, but not on the basis of the proportion of women in the country. If had that happened, they would have probably asked for 49% of seats and everything. So instead of doing that, what they wanted was the need that women have, which was a more important even
Yeah,
someone like Dakshayani Velayudhan. Dakshayani was an incredible argument she made in the course of the reservation debate. For scholarship, she said that if a Dalit, if you get 10 applications from Dalit women who want a scholarship, you have to give scholarship to the 10 Dalit women because that is what they want. Do not look at the numbers of Dalit women versus other women who don't want it. So I'm not the best person to do a theoretical political thing, but these are historical facts that happened here, and I think have great implications for our understanding of what was the authorial intention of the women members in the Constituent Assembly. I think that's where I can stop, or maybe I just add one line about what happened after the Constitution was framed. After the Constitution was framed, we had the 1952 elections. And interestingly, this is just a kind of a coda to the whole narrative. Most of these women members lost in the 1952 elections. And interestingly, to the rivals, the ideological rivals, against which they had been fighting all the while. So Renuka Rai, who was at the forefront of the reforms in Hindu law, lost the election to N.C. Chatterjee of the Hindu Mahasabha. Durga Bai, who was quite, if not quite, but who was not in favor of communists, lost the election in 1952 to a communist contestant. Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay lost an election to a minor Congress figure because she had joined the socialists and had been opposing Congress parties. She had lost that election. And who else? I'm forgetting the name. So most of them actually lost their elections, and they had to take a different route to work for the principles of the constitution, which they had which for which they had worked so hard to make. So I think that tells us a lot about women's role and what we have done to, or what we started doing to them, even as they had finished the making of the constitution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Achyut, for that. I'm sure it was not easy to sort of pack it all in about 45 minutes, but that very engaging discussion that, you have taken us through about the Constitution, the women in the Constitution, and what the Constitution did for women, their rights, what were the tensions between, the men and the large number of men and the few women. How did the women's voices make a presence felt? Was the representation merely, just a kind of a tokenism? But these were all very, very elite women who had really been part of the freedom movement. So, I think there have been a lot of critical reflections on, that a lot of other voices of women. There was no Adivasi woman, for example, in this thing. So voices from the margins still did not make it. I mean, while women's voices in some ways were, there, but a lot of other voices did not make it into the constitution. And today, I think this is such an important moment in contemporary times that we are talking about the constitution, because generally all of us now are, talking about the constitution for various other protests, movements, and we're going back to the constitution for really building arguments and counter arguments. So thank you so much for that. I would now like, because we ran out, started a little late, so let me open this out for comments, questions, and just a request. If you can, you just introduce yourself very briefly and make your questions or comments also brief, please, so that we can have a more democratic, larger number of people participating. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Divya, and I'm an MPhil student in Department of History at University of Hyderabad. And I have been working on this very topic for the past 2 years for my MPhil dissertation. And it has been quite unfortunate for me that I couldn't come across Sir's work. But now that I have had this very engaging session, I just want to ask two questions. One is, Sir, when I started working on this topic, I felt like this has not been worked on, and this study from Nepal had come out, so I felt like there should be something that should be done in India as well, and this inspired my interest. And also I wanted to apply feminist historiography on the Indian Constitution. So, but for you, what was the inspiration? And the second thing, as we talked about the constant backlash and criticism that these women have received because of constantly denying reservation for women and for minorities as well. Under that pretext and under many other pretexts, don't you think the general approach of all these women were quite a lot defined by the so-called progressive men of their times? Like you said, the agenda was all women representing all women, not proportional representation. That's there. But other than that, don't you think the other reason that these women denied reservation was that there was this whole momentum going on against a separate electorate, and then the very fear of the fact that if they go on and demand reservation, then they'll be seen in a very bad light, and they'll fail to bring out other reforms which they thought were important. That, and if we talk about Durgabai Deshmukh, who there was certain kind of vanguardism at the end of these women as well. For example, the way they treated the case of the prostitutes. For example, if we see the Sita Act, Suppression of Immoral Traffic in Women Act, coming in 1956, there was this association called Association for Social, Moral and Social Hygiene, which brought out the Sita Act, that adopts a very vanguardist kind of an approach towards the prostitutes in India. So, yeah, did I make my question clear? One is what
Uh,
inspired you for the research, and second is, do you also think that these women were shaped by the men around?
okay. I think there's so many questions, and you may find your own answers to those questions. My answers to these questions would be very simple. The first is that they are all historical. All these women were also historical creatures. So they were also shaped by the histories of their time. But it would be a complete travesty to say that they were shaped by the men of their times. Okay, it would be. I mean, what do you mean by saying that men shaped their ideas? These were women who were feminists of their times, of their generations. They had their own ideas of what patriarchy is and how patriarchy can be contested, how one can make a transformation in the society. So there is no question of them being influenced. Actually, it's the other way around. There have been several cases, and this may sound very uh, revealing, but the fact is that on the Hindu Code Bill, women members had taken much more progressive position than Ambedkar had taken. And Ambedkar was completely happy to follow the suggestions that women members were making. So there is no way in which one can make a hierarchy of this thing. On the question of representation, when I say all women can represent all women, again, you can see the same thing happening. So it means that you do not necessarily have to belong to the community, especially to represent. This is not an argument about universalizing of representation. This is an argument about the empathy, the understanding that you can develop about the experience of people or women from another community. So that does not really, that's a very nuanced position that we have to remember that these women had taken. So one can see that within the Constituent Assembly, there were several examples of Dakshayani being a member of the Hindu Code reforms, right? So that I don't think there is any doubt about the fact that these women were independent, autonomous thinkers, autonomous in the sense that autonomy, independent of the male presence or the masculinist patriarchal ideas. That there's no doubt about that. On the question of reservation, I don't think I ever mentioned that they were against reservation for minorities. What I
No,
but
sir, I didn't mean that. Like, I didn't say
right.
that you
So
said that. I think I came
no,
across as
so
saying,
those are misconceptions, if there are any. Women did say that yes, scheduled caste and scheduled tribes, there is a need for separate provisions for them, including reservations. 1959, if you look at the Renuka Ray Committee's report on backward classes, she is a member of. There are several very progressive suggestions that the committee makes about what can be done for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. This is because Sheila ma'am said something about Dalit Adivasi women not being there in the Constituent Assembly. The truth is that there were very few Adivasi men in the Constituent Assembly either. But the fact is that women did uh, take up this whole project of understanding the status of women in India. the term status of women, I think the word status is very, very significant in this whole context. This is the term that was used by the United Nations Commission, Subcommission on the Status of Women. This is the term that was used by the Role of Women, Women's Role in Planning Committee. This is the term that was used in the Towards Equality report of the 1975. The status of women was actually something that was counted in whatever theoretical models they had available at that point, that was calculated, understood through all kinds of surveys. So the census data was used, field research was done, and an enumerated community of women, and also the kind of differences that they had. So there were debates in the legislative section of the Constituent Assembly about working class women's rights, Dalit women who are who constitute the majority of the working class women, and so on. So it's not that that was a completely unmarked category, but of course, because it was a kind of a convergence of certain Marxist, socialist ideas about social change and the liberal civil rights idea of the civil liberties that was presented through the constitutional framework. So there was, of course, a kind of a tendency towards universalization, but that does not mean that it was an experiment in a blind kind of feminism. That's not how it happened. What is now known in feminist circles as lived experiences of women was counted at every single point. I mean, I just want to cite one simple example, and that probably can help you imagine this. Annie Mascarini, a member from Cochin, would travel all the way from Cochin to Delhi on a third class compartment in railways. And in the Constituent Assembly, she talked about the entire experience of traveling from Cochin to Delhi and the kind of misery, the kind of suffering that she had herself to go through, and the kind of suffering that she saw other women, co-passengers, going through. I think that whole metaphorical image of, the Cochin to Delhi Express, a woman's traveling through that, tells us how closely these women were attached to the whole idea of experience, reality of women. So I don't think that happens. And to the question about why I started working on this, when I started working on this was, I also, because I come from literature background, I also asked the same question from a feminist historiographical perspective. I began as a feminist literary critic, and I thought if there is a book, it should have authors. If there are fathers, there should be mothers, and that's how I started. And the secondary literature was totally misleading. It showed as if women were mute, silent, passive spectators in the framing of the Constitution. That's what the method of quilt quotations, picking up one line from the Constituent Assembly, another from somewhere else, and weaving them together, has done to the legacy of these women. So I think that should help you get a perspective.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Rama, do you want to say something?
Frankly, I find it very interesting. And I agree with, some of these issues that you spoke about, the way women thought about reservations and what they were for and what they oppose, etc. Those things but I just want to say something. I have no expertise on this, but I've seen this Sham Benegal's Samvidhan, and it was very interesting the way the women were portrayed. They all looked so self-possessed, and nobody was really like, the way they walked to the mic and the way they walked to the podium and talked. At least in the documentary, it was very interesting the way you felt that they were the women who came from a certain section, elite, if you want to call, and were confident enough to talk, confident the way they addressed the gathering and the way they talk. But that is the documentary. But I also feel that One of the things you were talking about women on secularism and how they understood secularism and religion. What was their opinion? I wish there was a little more on that. I don't know if you have enough documentation or enough on that. How did they understand secularism? Because today, when you talk about secularism, religion, much of it is really around women, the role of women, their virtue, and their position in the family, their position in the society, etc. So, do you find more on that?
Well, there are quite a few evidences about from which one can understand what they meant by secularism. Number one is that they did continuously use the word secularism, and they continuously kept saying that we want to make a secular state, and a secular state should not have any religious identity. That was something that they were continuously saying. So all laws that we are going to make uh, should be secularized as far as possible. So the term for them was secularization. And it was not just, it's like a two-way thing that they were participating in. One was the secularization of the society, and the other was the secularization of the law. Secularization of the society was a project. I mean, it's like a standard enlightenment project in which they were all they were participating in, because these women were also engaged in several uh, projects of educational reform in this country. Uh, they were trying to open new schools, open new professions, bringing in women out from their family, changing the roles of women, and asking women to come out of the religiously defined roles, what we call gender roles in society. So secularization and modernization was something that they thought of as a kind of a trajectory which will move finally towards the culmination when uh, people will start thinking of law as a secular force. This can be understood by their focus on the idea of the uniform civil code. I think a lot of stress has been paid to the idea of the uniformity of the code rather than the codeness of the code. What was important for these women was to codify law. Codify law was also to make law secular, to secularize law, take it out from the hands of religious priests and authors, Brahminical authors, or people who had given religious logic or religious arguments to justify a particular law. So codification, Durga Bai Deshmukh famously said, to be without a code is to be without justice, because she understood that if you do not have a code, you open women to all kinds of vulnerabilities, and the traditions that have been handed down to us over centuries will never be challenged. So they were in that sense in the mode of 19th 18th century enlightenment thinkers, but also believing that these two things can happen parallelly. So they said that once we have the civil code, the common civil code, we will not make it compulsory. It has to be a common civil code which will be optional, and we can hope that there will be a time when more and more people will start exercising this option. For example, the Special Marriage Act, that was the kind of a nucleus that they had for the idea of the common civil code. The second term, which I think is very important, is the second mistake, or I think it has happened inadvertently, but a lot of focus has been given to the word uniformity, as if there is some kind of a form which has to be imposed on all the other laws. Again, giving credit to these women for having to understand, to make a lot of effort to understand all the possible ways all the existing ways in which personal laws or religious laws in this country operate. What they were trying to do was to find what is common or what is commonly progressive in all these laws. So one can, I mean, I cite two examples here. They would regularly oppose the idea of making any change to laws which are already in favor of women, which are already existing laws. So instead of making a new law, they were trying to cull something out of the existing laws. And when there was nothing available, then make a new law. It was like activating an abstract principle only when you do not have an empirical law working at courts. So that is something that they did. Also, the focus on uniformity and the anxiety that of many scholars have is about the fact that uniformity would make it Brahminical. It would be like imposing the Brahminical Hindu code on all the other smaller codes or smaller laws. So there are again sufficient examples of women stressing that there are communities which have gender just customs. And these may be communities which are not classical Brahminical communities, so lower caste communities. That is, we need to take them up as models from which we can learn. And we can probably use those customs and codify them into the existing as the new law. So that was something that is happening there. That's the idea of secularism that I can at least extract. And apart from the fact that the state has to have a secular basis, when I said that they were advocating the right to marry in the in the community of the other, one can think of the partition. I think the partition debates had actually, the partition riots had actually shaped the debate, marked the debates in the Constituent Assembly in such a manner that India was a Hindu state and Pakistan was a Muslim state, and Indian Hindu women have been abducted by Pakistan Muslim men, and Muslim women have been abducted by Hindu women, and this debate was on. And in the middle of this debate, women were fighting for the consent of the woman, saying that the individual woman, irrespective of what community, what is the community of her birth, has the right to choose her partner even in these exceptional conditions. And we need to have ways to understand or to allow them to think independently rather than impose our idea of nations as religious ethnicity. So that's something that they were doing, which also gives, which also tells how what they meant by the idea of the nation as a secular nation. I'm not talking about the state as a secular state. Of course, even that, there were also several examples. I don't really talk about that, but there are several examples of, for example, Hansa Mehta and Darshani both saying, can we not rename the Banaras Hindu University? Why do we have to call it a Hindu university if the state is paying for its running? So an argument even as simple as that. So that shows how invested they were in the idea of secularism and the kind of contours of that secularism.
Thank you. Just one more question. Sarojini Naidu was opposed to reservations for women.
Yeah, I mean, all of these women were opposed to reservations for women. One have to. So the thing is that reservations for women in legislatures, it's a different thing from reservations for women in government jobs. So when they were saying that we do not want reservations in legislatures, they were opposing what they considered a kind of colonial practice of dividing communities and representatives. But when they kept quiet on the question of reservations in government jobs or in employment, they were actually trying to say that, okay, this will empower women, this will enhance their capabilities, this will increase their employment opportunities. So these were two, I think, very different issues that were at play, and to confuse one with the other has probably created this idea that women were opposed to reservations. Also, the fact that they were trying to run an all India women's conference in the times when the two nation theory was at its peak. and there was a continuous communal divide which was increasing, like the schism was growing by the day, and Muslim women were leaving All India Women's Conference and joining the Muslim League, and campaigning with Jinnah for Pakistan. So it was a very difficult time for them. In 1946, when they met the cabinet commission, and Samita clearly said that we are opposed to the idea of partition. So I think that also was something that was in their mind when they opposed the idea of reservations, because now the idea of reservations has become an upper caste versus lower caste kind of a quote unquote debate. But in the 1940s and 1930s and 40s, it was more about reservations for Hindus and reservations for Muslims. That was probably more central to the narrative. So that may have played a role in their position.
I think that's a more nuanced critique of Sarojini Naidu, because today, there are many who are very critical of her opposition to reservation. Anyway,
But Sarojini played no role in the Constituent Assembly. 15th of August 1947, she became the governor of United Provinces, and she resigned from the Constituent Assembly. And the major debates took place after that.
that's true.
Okay, sure. There is another hand up. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Ma'am, I'm Pradeep Kumar Naik, so I'm from Odisha. So I belong to civil service, Odisha Administrative Service. Somehow I got the link from Professor Arun Patnaik, sir. So my straightforward question to Dr. Chetan is that first of all, you spoke so nicely. I never heard, because we these days find transformative constitution, the so-called this living constitution, so many issues. In fact, earlier we had read even our Kabira Sari's line. So passive revolution, all these things. But you spoke so well, I never read these things. So now question is, somewhere I read Bina Agrawal had written about property rights, land rights for women. There she wrote that if during making of the Indian constitution, there is no debate that women right to property is mixed with her family. See, there is no different rights. Her interest is identified with family. Why should be property rights? Why should she be given independent rights? So later on, this movement came in the offshoot. So would you like to say anything? Women, at that time they highlighted. No, we should have. I think you have highlighted some, but I'm sorry, sir, I could not have remembered. So how they negotiated the separate, independent, so-called legal rights of women, because there are some, it's just now told gender just customer rights. That is difficult to say. They must be in among our tribal pockets. So what is that? Secondly, this mirror of violence kind of Bina Das, even our Ramchandra Guhade wrote these. You just spoke also the kidnapping, marrying forcefully. So how the domestic violence and also the family violence in our sexual violence, all this mirror. Anything you would like to say very briefly? Thank you.
Uh, Thank you. So that's like the too many questions and would take a lot of time. But just briefly speaking, I can tell you a few things. I mean, the constitution making has nothing to do with property rights in that direct sense. But in the legislatures, when they were debating the Hindu Code Bill, actually the crux of the whole debate was about the Hindu woman's right to property. And right to property in two senses. So one in the sense of the property of the father, and the other in this the property as a co-parsoner. The whole debate was about transforming the status of women as co-parceners, women who could also inherit, daughters who can inherit the property of their of the ancestral property. So that debate was there. There were two important documents to which I can refer to you. One is, of course, this whole question of reforms in agricultural property. So I will cite the two documents, and that will give you the right picture. So when the National Planning Committee in 1939 constituted several subcommittees for the future of reforms. One was the Women's Role in Planned Economy Committee. That committee actually recommended that even agricultural land has to be reformed, and the the struggle that Hindu women are having for inheritance in their ancestral property should be extended to agricultural land as well. So daughters can also have agricultural land. But that was a suggestion which was never taken up, which was not taken up at least till 1950, the reform in agricultural land. So most of the debates were confined to women's right in non-agricultural land. That property was kept out of it. But women continuously kept on saying that we need to extend this whole thing and we need to also reform the law for agricultural land. In the Constant Assembly legislative debates, we see several such debates. And if Beena Agrawal has said this, I don't think she has said this, but if she has said this, then probably she has not looked carefully at the documents and at the debates. The Hindu Code Bill, I actually wanted to say this even in the course of my talk, that after these women lost their 1952 election, the campaign for the Hindu Code Bill in the first Lok Sabha got weakened, because you did not have the same passion, the same women who had engaged with the Hindu code reform in the first Lok Sabha. And when we had the final Hindu code reforms happen in 1956, 1955, 1956, we do not see women getting the same kind of rights that they had started asking for in 1941, 42, 43 onwards. So that is something which was there. The other document to which I was referring was the same National Planning Committee's recommendations, subcommittee on reforms in agricultural land. That committee eventually took a very conservative position. It did not suggest that we can do this. So that is the kind of, you see this dichotomy happening, women actually wanting for a complete change in the land inheritance system in this country. So that these are the two questions. The second question that you asked was about the abduction of women and so on. I think I spoke about this. So there are two mistakes, I would say, that has percolated in partition historiography from 1998 onwards, when there was a zeal among feminist historians to show that the partition uh, took place on the passive side of the woman's body, as if women were just, I mean, the terms they use are semiotics, empty semiotics, women who did not have to say anything, and that the partition took place. But if you look at the documents carefully, if you remember, I mentioned that Mridula Sarabhai was not elected to the Constant Assembly, or women did not want her to get elected to the Constant Assembly. Kamala Bhasin and Ritu Menon mentioned this little fact, that there was a kind of a divergence in the view of Mridula Sarabhai and Rameshwari Nehru. There were two camps among the social workers who were involved in the rescuing of women during those partition riots. Mridula Sarabhai had taken the position because she was in charge officially of the whole thing. She had taken this one would say, extreme position that no matter what the woman says, we have to rescue her, because there is no way of knowing what is in her mind. Rameshwari Nehru, on the other hand, being a more seasoned, more senior woman, and also of a different generation, probably Rameshwari Nehru had a more I would say sensitive position to this, where she believed that no, we need to find out what the woman thinks before rescuing her. And the women members of the Indian Constituent Assembly, the AIWC women, Hansa Mehta and Purnima Banerjee and Amrit Kaur, were all closer to Rameshwari Nehru than they were to Mridula Sarabhai, both personally and also in ideological terms. So the members in the Constituent Assembly did actually it's also about how you interpret that. But if one looks at all their interventions together, one finds incredible sensitivity in their support for the right of the victim woman, saying that the victim woman needs to be number one. I can still recall the debate Durga Bai, which is what Veena Das actually reads and reads wrongly to my mind. The first argument that she makes is Durga Bai makes is that we need to give time to these women. We cannot have a law, and law is also about time. So we cannot say that by the 15th of October 1951, all women will have to be rescued, because women will take time to make up their mind, to understand what they are going through, to go through this trauma. So that was the first suggestion she gave. The second is, and I think it's a bizarre kind of amnesia in historiography, that we forget that Durga Bai was a lawyer who understood the meaning of the word consent probably better than many others did. And she understood that a consent can be forced, a consent can be manipulated, a consent, as a contract lawyer, a person who had worked in contract law and was also a field worker in social services. So Durga Bai's attention to the idea of consent was extremely important. We people have forgotten that. In the same debate, on the same day, actually, you see Purnima Banerjee and Renuka Ray making an argument for for effective relationships, saying that maybe in these extraordinary circumstances, a man and a woman from hostile communities have come together. But perhaps it is in these circumstances that they have been able to develop a romantic, affective, emotional bond, which we need to privilege over our great zeal to rescue them or to impose nationality or citizenship on them. So these were some of the arguments which were there. Of course, there were limitations to this intervention. For example, they would be very wary and not use the word rape. They will not use the word sexual violence, which are, of course, limitations of the time. One cannot expect women of 1949 to have the same priorities that feminists of 1990 have or 2020 have. So they were constrained by those things. Their language was constrained by those things. But I think this question of the woman's consent was very much a part of the making of the Constitution.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. This is hello, ma'am. Yeah.
Yeah. Please.
Okay. Thank you, sir. You're very, very objective and powerful presentation. You highlighted the very, the grasp of the women participation and emancipation in our freedom struggle and national politics in afterward. But I have a keen observation as one of my scholar is working. Oh yeah, I forgot myself, Dr. Pramod Rai. I teach in a aided college in Utkal University affiliation, and I guide some PhD scholars too. So one of my scholars is working the exact topic, the women who dare, and making history during the freedom struggle. Yeah. So my point of view, I closely observe from your presentation and what I observe exactly. If you look, the roots of the participation of women in national politics during the British imperial regime also dates back to the early 19th century. 19th century reform movement. And Bina Majumdar rightly observed that although the 19th century social reforms movement opened a new vista for the women participation in politics, but it is considered as the movement that laid foundation for the women's movement, but it was restricted to a very very limited arena. And if you look at the women who basically during Gandhi's clarion call, it even Madhu Kishore rightly pointed out. The Gandhi, it was Gandhi who succeeded in galvanizing the traditional housebound woman as a powerful instrument of political action during the freedom struggle. But if you look at, the number of women who joined the freedom struggle and actively participated equally par with men. But if you come to the power position, when the women who acquired power position towards the end of the freedom struggle and in the National Constitutional Assembly, in 1937 election, only 8 women were elected to the from general constituency and 42 from the reserve constituency. If you look at to that in the Constituent Assembly in December 1946, only 14 women were members in the Constituent Assembly. So, but looking at except a few like few women like Hansa Mehta, Begum Saha, and those who became the parliamentary secretaries and subsequently in Bombay and Punjab respectively. But very few, very microscopic minority women in comparison to the level of participation, degree of participation, they are given birth in political power positions. So how do you look at? Do you say, so is Madhu Kishore is right? The Gandhi galvanized the housebound woman as powerful instrument of political action, or Bina Majumdar was very rightly on her perspective, or as you say, as you talk of women had a powerful, contribution. We know, we accept they had a powerful contribution. Even extremist movement also, many women, those who operated like they operated underground movements par equal to the the men that operated during the freedom struggle. So my point is, how do you say that how the role of women remain unnoticed, as even our only few, those who have a political nexus and background, Vijayalakshmi Pandit and all this, Amrit Kaur you talked of, a very few microscopic minority. But if you look at their degree, dimension, and magnitude of participation, they equally contributed.
Just quickly.
So what is your observation? Precisely, tell.
No, I think you made all the observations. I have no observations to this.
What is your comment, sir?
See, I mean, this is a question of political sociology. I mean, why women don't participate? What is the kind of, what kind of families send women to participate in politics and so on? I really don't think I am equipped to answer this question. The only answer I can give from the perspective, the history that I have done is that women, the women I'm talking about, or the leaders of the women's movement that they represented, did try their best to bring out women from their homes and join politics, and bring out all kinds of women, not just the elite women, but women from the lower strata of society. They were also for the decentralization of power. They were also for bringing in women from villages and so on. So it's just, I mean, that's the thing. It's always the gap between the ideal that the law sets and the practice that the society does. So I think the answer to that question is something that that will emerge only when we look at what happens in the society. I can only do the political part of this history.
Thank you.
Yeah. More questions?
And is there anyone else? Or we are, at least the Indian lot must be hungry. I know Professor Kaviraj will be longing for some good breakfast while we are at dinner. But any comments or... Arun, do you have anything to say?
No.
Professor Kaviraj, would you like to comment or say something?
Yes, there are a couple of things. I had two comments.
Achyut would feel very cheated if you didn't say something.
No. I don't know very much about this. I had a comment and a question to Achyut, and I want to make a remark about the first question that came up by Divya. Achyut, the question that I had, it's a simple question. You said probably about the Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties.
Yes.
or something, that Hansa Mehta was one of the writers. Who was the second writer?
So I spoke about two documents. One was the women's role in planned economy. That was a subcommittee that Nehru and Nehru's
Okay.
Congress had formed. It had around 10 members. Hansa Mehta was one of those members. 1939. So at that point, she was still a younger feminist, or maybe someone was moving towards a senior position. 1945, she is the president of the All India Women's Conference, and they float an idea of having an Indian Women's Charter of Rights and Duties. Uh, it would take more time to talk about the Indian part of it, because it was presented in various international organizations and it had a definite Indianness about it. For example, it incorporated some number of Gandhian suggestions. Uh, if one notices the name of the whole charter, it's the Charter of Rights and Duties. So it had a little tail kind of a piece about the duties that women have, and it thought about rights and duties in connection with each other. This was prepared by at least 4 or 5 women. Hansa Mehta was the chief drafter of it, but
No,
Hansa Mehta.
in one case, you said that there were two authors. One was Hansa Mehta.
Right. I said about
Am I-
one. No, I said that about the women's role in planned economy document, the 1939 document, of which Hansa Mehta was one of the authors, one of
Oh,
the
I see.
several authors. And this one also was co-drafted by Hansa Mehta, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, Renuka Rai, and Lakshmi Menon. Lakshmi Menon was the
Yeah.
editor of the All India Women's Conference's newsletter, Roshni.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
these 4 women had drafted this, and just to share this information, after the charter was drafted, they actually started celebrating several weeks dedicated to each of these rights in 1946. So there was a week dedicated to right to liberty of speech, the right to equal pay for equal work, and so on. And they used to organize workshops in various colleges and schools. I do not have very great amount of data on this, but definitely suggestive of the fact that they would they would do what is consciousness uh, raising programs on the various rights that the Indian Women's Charter of Duties have. There was a tendency, or there was a strategy that women were using right from 1935 onwards. There was 1937 election and the 1946 election. Before each of these elections, the AIWC would send a set of questionnaires to the prospective candidates who were contesting these elections, asking what position would you take on these questions that we are asking. So 1945, this draft was also, the urgency behind this draft was also to make sure that the 1946 elections, before the 1946 elections, we can send this draft, this charter to the various prospective candidates who can then make up their mind about the positions of these. These are the rights that we have. Because women were aware that they will probably always be few in numbers in the legislatures, but they can send some men who can represent these causes for them. So that's the history.
My second point, which is partly a question for you, is in your book, because I've read your book quite some time back and I don't remember it in such detail. You touched on something in your discussion about Ambedkar, Dakshayani Velayuthan, and all these women talking about the question of reservation. There are two types of problems here. One is the actual provisions and clauses that they're discussing in the context of the Constitution, and what are their justifications and counter arguments, etc. But all these are linked to some questions which are very important questions for political theory. And one which you touched on, my question is whether you have more in your book on this. I wish you have, which is the question of reservation on the basis of identity and reservation on the basis of need. What you showed, which I found very, very interesting, is if you refine that argument, because I'm sure, these are some of the most extraordinarily intelligent women thinking about the issues of their time. So I think it's patronizing to think that they did not see something which we see because we come after them. But I think what I found extraordinarily interesting there was that, there's a sense that when you ask for a reservation for an identity, right, it is basically dual demand. The demand that we can see is the demand for reservation for an identity. But there is also an underlying demand, underlying the identity thing of need. That is, why do I can ask, why should I give reservation to scheduled caste, right? The answer is that because they need them. Why do we give reservation to women? Because they need them, right? So in a certain sense, when people are not talking about the question of need, there is an unstated argument of need which underlies the argument about identity reservation. And the reason why it is very important is that through historical evolution, through institutional change, historical change through capitalism, etc., the group of people who have the identity and the group of people who have the need can separate off, can become, not completely coincident. In fact, if you use the Indian logic kind of thing, they would say that the vyapti, that is the coverage of these two groups, might not be identical. What I'm trying to say is that, even the original argument about identity has an unstated need argument at the base. And I think it's a very, very interesting question of political theory, which I think you should pursue a little bit. If you have done it in your book, then fine. But your book is already in print almost, so you cannot change it now. If you have not, my request to you would be that you should think about that. And finally, I don't want to take too much of time. I wanted to make just one point. This is to the general group, but also to Divya. I do not see her here, but it can be passed on. The reason why I found Achyut's work so riveting, so interesting, is not just because of what he shows about women in the Constituent Assembly, not just what he shows about the work of these women as political leaders in India. What I found really extraordinary was the way it challenges something which is very deep in our thinking, that something that is significant historically must happen in the West first, and we follow, right? This is also true of feminism. I think it's very important to understand that. Feminists themselves have written about it. Chandra Tarpar Mahanti, Gayatri Spivak, they have occasionally touched on this. But I wanted to warn people about how systematic it is. And so therefore, what I found most interesting about Achyut's work is the sense, because I'm not a historian of the same material, so I cannot say whether he is right or wrong. I assume that he is right. If he is right, what it shows is that these people had a much clearer identity of what is central to feminism. That is, of course, there are women. There have been women from the time of beginning, but women as an identity who have independent interests and who need to think of those interests on the basis of their distinctive experience. That is the core of feminism. And what is interesting is that these people do not use the word feminism, but they are people who anticipate this absolutely profound theoretical point about feminism, I think more clearly than Western feminists are doing at that time. I don't think we should get into this game of who is first, who is next, etc. Nationalists once used to do that. That's not my point. But my point is that we should not get maneuvered into a position, where we take a more seemingly radical position and say that these people are unclear about something. They're not unclear about that. The language for that is not yet prepared. But in the content of their thinking, as Eleanor Roosevelt and others in the West acknowledged, that sometimes the Indian women have actually done more thinking. They're more advanced in their thinking than people in the West. So that is, quite apart from what Achyut's work shows about the Constituent Assembly, the leadership of women in thinking about these things. I thought that this is something which is also very, very important. And this is something that we should not allow, to be dissipated or changed, simply because we are so much under the influence of trends of thought, which are powerful in the Western and American academia. I'm saying this because I work inside, and so I feel sometimes that there are deeply distortive effects of that, and it is an effect which is basically a kind of colonial effect. Yeah. Thank you, Achyut, for something which is very, very, very interesting as always.
Thank you, Sithuda, for that very insightful point and for all your remarks. I think what I said today is something that has not gone into my work in the same words that I used today. I am probably deliberately did not use the word identity there. But I have made this point that women were not seeking representation on the proportional basis, but they were thinking representation on need basis. This is something that I've said. And
my point is that this is a general point, but I don't think we make this point sufficiently strongly and sufficiently often. People now acknowledge, people who work on constitutionalism everywhere, including here, people now acknowledge that the Indian Constitution was an extraordinary document of the 20th century because it went into the American Constitution or the French Constitution initially were of a totally different historical era, right? They have influence, they work as models in a certain sense, but the world that came out of the Second World War was a completely different world from the world of the French Revolution and the world of the American Revolution. And most people acknowledge now that the Indian Constitution was a very important attempt collectively by a group of people to try to understand what the nature of this epoch is, what are the liberation possibilities in this epoch, and how do you try to do it in a way which becomes stable, which becomes, in a certain sense, permanent by putting it into the Constitution.
Yes.
So there's a lot of acknowledgement of that. And the thing is that, many of these things, reservation, affirmative action, which are all rights-based questions, the question of rights and diversity. I think in the modern period, the Indian Constitution and the debates around the Indian Constitution is the first body of thought which grappled with these questions. And I think we should actually look at that body of thought with very great regard and not simply say that, this person is right, that, of course, from our point of view, somebody would be right and somebody would be less right or wrong. But I think what we should celebrate and what we should not really celebrate, but try to develop in our own thinking would be the general resources of that thinking in the Indian constitutional debates, not just the Constituent Assembly, but as you said, when we read the Constituent Assembly and do not read the parliamentary paper, which is going on in the evening of the same day, I think we get a distorted picture. So my point is that, just as when we look at great thinkers in the West, we not merely have regard for somebody like Hobbes and Locke and Rousseau or Marx, we also have regard, for Western political thought. That is something which is so important. I think what I'm saying is that we should develop a similar attitude towards our thinking at the time of constitution making, because it is of the same kind. And so, quite apart from thinking well of Nehru and Gandhi and Ambedkar and these individual women, I think it's very important to see that they're getting into some of the most important questions of collective living in our times. It's in a world which emerged out of the Second World War. So that's what I found so fascinating in your work.
Thank you, Sithuda. I really think that's like, I can't think of any other historical moment in world history which had brought so many forces, social, political, and all kinds of forces to one parliament. where people had to sit together and decide for the future. And the other thing that I just wanted to add, since you have, I think I still have some time to recuperate this and add it to my book also, is this fact that because the Indian Constitution was drafted over a period of 3 years, the length of the time also allowed people to think more carefully about issues, to
Of course.
sometimes even revise their own opinions, learn from what other people have said, and acknowledge that, okay, I was wrong on that particular day, but maybe I can correct myself today. So this happened many times in the Constituent Assembly, something which we can only extract if we pay very close attention to how people were debating there.
You
And
know,
all,
if you write on this, I would suggest that you should expand on that. Let me give you an example, because this is a very important question, very important point about the nature of deliberation. The nature of deliberation. Deliberation is recursive. What is important about deliberation is not that we do our best and try to come to the best conclusion possible, right? That's not how we think. We think about things, and then I talk to you, and my mind changes a little bit, and then next day I talk to Arun, and my mind changes a little bit more. And so ultimately I come to a decision. The Buddhists, I read it, I think in Bhandarkar somewhere, they had a procedural rule that they would want to decide about something that is very important. So they would have a vote, and then the next day they would have a day which is free of debate. They can consult with people individually, but there would not be any general debate, right? And the consultation is like my talking to you and my talking to Arun, people in whom I have trust. And then the decision would be taken by a second vote. The second vote is the binding vote. What I find extraordinary about that is that, how insightful that is about the nature of the deliberative process in human beings. And what you were saying is something which is similar to that. That's also something that we should point out when we talk about the Constituent Assembly. The deliberative process of the Constituent Assembly. And what you are saying about the women, I think shows that the women are actually probably more sensitive to this and doing this much more in their collective practice than other people in the Constituent Assembly.
I use one of the epigraphs that I use is Rajendra Prasad's statement when he says, every member here has a right to be inconsistent. So that's what he says there. And because otherwise people will be bound by what they had said the previous day, and then they can never make a progress.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
It's very late for you now.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
this may be a later point.
Okay. Can I request Hannah, because it is a little late, and a student of ours to just give a vote of thanks. We're trying not to be very formal, but there are certain, we would like to thank all of you who've made this possible. Hannah, yeah.
Yes, ma'am. It is my privilege to have been asked to propose a vote of thanks on this occasion. And I would like to, at the outset, express my sincere thanks to Professor Arun Kumar Patnaik for having given me this opportunity. It has been a truly erudite session. There are very many valuable takeaways that we could have from today's discussion. Personally, one such takeaway for me is how it animates my own imagination and how I wish it would animate the imagination of the nation henceforth. Dr. Achyut began with how the important contributions of women in the drafting of the Constitution has been under the shadow of the founding fathers. I would like to contrast this with a picture that has been taking rounds in social media in the context of Kamala Harris's victory as the Vice President of USA. The picture shows Kamala Harris striding forward confidently with a shadow, not her own, but of her child, which is none other than Ruby Bridges. And an interesting quote that has followed the image has been the following, that Rosa sat so Ruby could walk, so Kamala could run. And this is what I personally wish this book would do to our imagination, that it brings our constitution in the shadow of the founding mothers as much as that of the founding fathers, so that we can all stride confidently towards light and justice irrespective of differences of any kind. On that note, I extend my sincere gratitude and thanks to Dr. Achyut Chetan for taking his time out to engage with us and share his thoughts on his very enlightening book. Next, I extend my warm thanks to Professor Sheila Prasad for chairing this session and making profound contributions to the discussion. I would also like to thank our most valued attendees, Professor Kaviraj, Nilanjana ma'am, and Rama ma'am. Your scholarly presence has been vital to the dialogue we could have today. Last but not the least, I thank everyone who attended for listening patiently and for your questions that have allowed us to have an insightful academic session. Thank you. On this note, good night to everyone.
Thank you so
Good
much.
night.
Bye.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for that. And thank you all. A special thanks to Achyut again for really what a rich learning experience it has been,
Thank you so
personally
much.
for me, and I'm sure for all of us who joined this meeting. And thank you, Arun, for sort of getting all of us together, and Professor Kaviraj for telling Arun to invite Achyut. I think this is a really good collaborative effort that we've all benefited from. Thank you all so much, and take care.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Very stimulating, very educative for me.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.